Hi, everybody. I am going back uh, to the review session that we've been talking about for school. So we'll take it from there. I had basically finished the limited amount of respiratory and the rather large amount of digestive and urinary, which brings us to the last area, which we're actually going to be looking at more in earnest today and Thursday, which is male and female repro. We're going to have to get all of that done, and we will, I'm sure. That's not necessarily the issue, but we will start from that point on. So really where it begins is here with reviewing the questions. And first is basically anatomical questions regarding the male reproductive system. I'll try to get through that now this morning and give you some more information, of course, in lecture. So anatomically, we're dealing, again, everything are accessory structures other than testes and ovaries. So if we're dealing with the male, we're just dealing with testes. So once the sperm are produced, and the sperm are produced in an area called the seminiferous tubules, and once they are produced, they are basically work their way slowly into a collecting structure called the epididymis. It surrounds the testes. It's rather elaborate, and they spend about 3 weeks in there effectively maturing. Okay. And a certain amount of secretions come along with it as well. And that's really a critical area. And they're really stored in there until the time when they're ejaculated. So effectively, you're going to see it's a very interesting structure when we look at it in the lecture hall, and you see some of the images that are there. An interesting side note, particularly when we're dealing with the male, is testicular cancer. And one of the interesting things is a condition called cryptorchism. Cryptorchism is an undescended testicle. It's more common than you think, but it has a high association with testicular cancer, oddly enough. Testicular cancer is a very common cancer in relatively young men between, let's say, 20 to 40, that sort of age range. And the good news about that, it's eminently treatable. And again, it's the idea of redundancy. We have two ovaries, two testes, multiple areas we've covered over the time we've been together. And that's a really significant feature because these individuals who may have to have a testicle removed for that purpose are still able to conceive children thereafter. And it's a relatively high cure rate comparatively with the appropriate treatment that's there. And the testicles themselves are interesting. Where the ovaries reside within the abdominal peritoneal cavity, testes descend. They descend through something called the spermatic cord, which is very, very sensitive with a ton of blood vessels and nerves and lymphatics that are effectively pulled down by a string-like structure. Fancy name is called a gubernaculum. I don't even know if they use that anymore. And as the male child matures in utero, they begin to descend through this cord, and there's an opening in the inguinal ligament. That's the site when we hear about sports ruptures or sports hernias. That's the area. It's very delicate, very painful. Obviously, if it's struck or traumatized or anything gets trapped in there, they're nasty. My second oldest had both sides had to be repaired, and they used a mesh in there, which is not really a good item. There's been a lot of problems with the mesh. So fortunately, he hasn't had to have any after surgery from that. And he was working a lot of construction and a lot of auto type stuff, heavy industrial stuff at that time. That was a good 10 to 15 years ago. So when the testes descend, what they accomplish is effectively a lower temperature, and that optimizes sperm production. And the amount, and a rather substantial amount of blood vessels in that area, particularly capillary and venous plexes, groups of veins and capillaries, are able to absorb the heat that the activity of production involves. So that's really significant. And the other thing that's interesting is because sperm are produced they're not produced till adolescence. Eggs are produced right away. So eggs are not seen as foreign. And women are born with the eggs. Men are not born with sperm. And so when the sperm are produced, they are, because they're diverse, they're genetically unlike your own cells, they would be responded to and attacked as being foreign. That's why we have something called a blood testicular barrier. So that whole area is sort of sequestered in a sense from the immune system. So when the sperm are produced, they're constantly surrounded by structures that don't allow white blood cells to attack them. It's when there's trauma to that area or an infection that can really almost go haywire. If you want to put it in sort of interesting terms, where the body begins to attack sperm cells. So we see that mostly in traumatic, but that's really a significant thing. Okay, so it really protects them from attack by white blood cells. The ejaculant by volume is mostly made out of fluids. Seminal fluid, about 2/3 of it. The other third is roughly prostatic fluid. The sperm cells are so ridiculously tiny. If we said by number, it would be overwhelmingly sperm cells. There are hundreds of millions in a typical ejaculant. It's just remarkable, but they need that many in order to achieve fertilization because of a variety of factors that we'll deal with a little bit in physiology without going crazy. Uh, when I do a unit, which I don't do in AP2, with the advanced physiology, we have an end unit that we talk about growth and development and conception, where it's fairly interesting. I just can't get to it in the amount of time that I have for our particular course. That's there. But hey, if I do a lecture, I'll be happy to send it to you down the road. Major problem with men, prostate disease. You're looking at one. We're virtually looking at one in this case. I had prostate surgery a year ago, and I'm trying to think exactly when I had it done. But I had prostate surgery done. I'm going to tell you, maybe around the 1st of October of last year, and it took quite a long time uh, for things to resolve and improve over time. This was more secondary to my bladder cancer because it created there was so much treatment that went on that the prostate enlarged. It wasn't prostatic disease, certainly was not prostatic cancer. But what men do once they reach a certain age, roughly 40, you do two tests. Years ago, they basically did a digital rectal exam to see if it was enlarged or had a lump or irregular or painful. That would tend to require further investigation. Now we have what's called prostatic sensitive antigen, and that's a really useful tool in the blood that is used not only to monitor treatment for prostate cancer, but we look for changes in it to see if there has been uh, some irregularity that would point to. So if when it goes down, if there's someone's under treatment, it's great. But if it goes up, big problems that are there. So those are really important elements that are there. When we start talking about the physiology of the system, and this is covered a little bit. You might have had an autonomic nervous system. This is one of those interesting systems that's a marriage between the autonomic nervous system, the stimulation in the process of sexual arousal is about parasympathetics, and the eventual climax or ejaculation is part of the sympathetics. You should remember that it's a unique aspect of the nervous system that does not involve voluntary muscle activity. There's a whole lot of things, obviously, it's stimulated, they go into it. I don't think we need to reiterate it. Sperm remember, there's two major hormones in this system: follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone is about testosterone. Follicle stimulating hormone is about sperm production. The same is true in the female. When we have basically the egg production and egg maturation and eventual ovulation is under the realm of follicle stimulating hormone. That's when we see it in the female reproductive. That's impressive in the early phase. Where in the later phase, it's luteinizing hormone that's mostly there in the, let's say, after mid-cycle. And in men, that's certainly the ones that's involved. So it produces mostly progesterone in the female and testosterone in the male. Interesting, and we'll go over that as well. So I think that's something that's really remembering. So testosterone, follicle stimulate, beg your pardon, luteinizing hormone, and sperm follicle stimulating hormone. Sperm are interestingly unique because they don't run on glucose. It has to be fructose. And you're going to see that's in some of the secretions that we find in both this, principally in the seminal and in the prostatic fluid that's there. So the seminal fluid, it plays a lot of roles with regard to providing enzymes and providing the bulk of the fluid that's part of the ejaculation. Whereas prostatic fluid, it's not necessarily as typically clear, but it does seem to play a role in increasing the activity as well as the viability of the sperm. Okay. So once they're there, once they're made, and it doesn't really have anything to do with production, but it makes them more active and survive longer in the process of finalizing fertilization, so to speak. So it also has that prostatic fluid is that white milky kind of component that's very characteristic that we begin to see, where seminal fluid has. That's where we get that ultraviolet fluorescence that they utilize in crime scenes and rape scenes. And when they start, oh, we're looking for fluids, and they start getting the ultraviolet light out to examine it. The critical feature in this chemically is nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a very interesting chemical that we're just learning a lot about. It has a lot to do with brain development. Blood vessels, when they're stretched, begin to produce it to allow them to relax. And that is what the trigger is. Once whatever stimulates someone sexually, the nitric oxide is what produces effectively the erection because it tends to dilate blood vessels, they fill with blood, and at the same time, this combination of factors facilitates it. So that's a big player. Estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone are all produced by, I beg your pardon, they're all produced as a byproduct of cholesterol. So they're cholesterol or fatty based hormones, which is always interesting. Okay, they tend to stick around a little bit longer. They have more prolonged and longer effects than protein-based hormones, which are broken down a little bit more easily. So cholesterol is the big player. When we get to the female, we begin to see in some interesting things that are there. There are some structural modifications, particularly when the egg is ejected. When the egg is ejected from the ovary, it's interestingly, it's not a closed system. Sperm are closed. Remember that blood testes barrier. So sperm go directly in from production into the epididymis, into the what they call the vas or ductus deferens, and eventually are ejaculated. Not so. In the ovary, actually ejected into the peritoneal cavity, very close to the opening to the tubes. There are tiny structural modifications, what are called the fimbriae, the finger-like projections that appear to envelop the ovary but don't. They're not in direct contact. They are ciliated cells. And those cilia, probably pseudostratified columnar ciliated cells. And the cilia move and they create, and there's little mucus strands and they create little eddies or currents that draw the egg in. So normally it goes in. Comparatively rarely, you can actually get an ectopic pregnancy in the abdominal peritoneal cavity. More often they are in the tubal pregnancies. So that's really important. And with a class that's predominantly, nearly entirely female, most of you are familiar with the typical test that we use, particularly for cervical carcinoma, and that's the PAP or Papanicolau smear. So Papanicolau is the doctor's name or whoever the scientist name that developed it, and it's really an important test to consistently do during the childbearing years. Okay, HPV is everywhere. It's the most common of the sexually transmitted disorders, unfortunately. And a lot of times it's silent in its presentation and not visible in its presentation. And surely, as we talk about in micro, 15 to 30% of all cancers are related directly to viral invasions. About half of them come from HPV. So again, don't forget the uterine anatomy. The uterus is domed. It actually has a fundus, which is the dome top. A very, very large organ that's almost entirely made of smooth muscle. The lining is the interesting part. The lining in the interior, the lining that's eventually going to where the fertilized egg is going to implant, has a double layer. It has what's called a stratum basalis that's always there, and it generates what's called a stratum functionalis. Again, stratum means layer, and that functionalis tissue is where the implantation, and that's the part that grows and evolves and increases in size and in density and in glandular structure, and is eventually shed during menstruation, if in the absence of implantation. It's caused by structures called the spiral arteries that go into spasm when a structure called the corpus luteum, which is what's left of the follicle or the housing of the egg, deteriorates. It deteriorates after 10 days, if there's been no implantation. If there's been implantation, it stays active for a couple of months until the placenta develops. And when those spiral arteries kink up and spasm, they build a pressure head. And when the spasm is released, you know, at that point, which it does, then at that point, that rush of blood is what propels the functionalis to be shed along with tissue fluid and a small, relatively small amount of blood. A little blood goes a long way, we talked about before. We look, this is also, we look at the breast more acutely with regard to what happens when things go wrong. Breast is mostly fatty tissue. There are glandular elements. Breast cancer is in the glandular elements. We'll go over bits about the breast cancer genes. But breast cancers, because the glandular elements have a lot of lymphatics that are associated with them, and they all end up going to the axil of the underarm. So whenever there's a lump in the breast that has to be removed, let's say the mammogram is negative or mammogram is not conclusive and the ultrasound is not conclusive, if they have to do a lumpectomy, they're always going to do a lymph node, because you have to remove a lymph node to examine it, because that's where it's, a lot of times that's where the positive finding will be there. So you have to be very, very watchful of that as well. So again, just like in the male, progesterone, okay, is typically has most of its activity on the uterus itself. That's its primary site of activity. The estrogen has more to do with secondary characteristics and the follicles and physique, etc. So when they are active, such in pregnancy, when we have relatively high levels of estrogen and progesterone, they basically suppress ovulation. They suppress follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone release. And that's really the original. I do not know what the pharmacology is today. I don't know how they're composed today for birth control pills. But originally, they were just mixtures of estrogen and progesterone. I don't know enough about them to be able to talk about that aspect of pharmacology, but typically the estrogen in the birth control pill is the problem area. I remember a gal I went to high school with, they put her on that very early because she had a condition where she developed blood clots in her leg, which really wasn't clearly understood. Very athletic, but not small. The best way to play it. And she eventually uh, developed, uh, they put her on the pill, and then she began to, and it didn't, if anything, it caused, so she had blood clots in the veins. It actually made them worse. I mean, she was walking around in a cast for 2 years when she came to our school, a little bit on the late side rather than the early side when she transferred in. So it's very interesting that they used that therapeutically, and then they discovered some of the problems that were with it. Okay. And other things, be familiar with what occurs vis-a-vis menopause when we get into that discussion. So one of the things you worry about with the lack of estrogen and progesterone, particularly the estrogen production, we tend to see osteoporosis, bone density goes down. Unfortunately, cholesterol levels tend to go up. Okay. Secondary sexual organs begin to become somewhat, I hate to use the word atrophy, but it's really clinically, and things like hot flashes. Atrophy would suggest that they're completely shrinking. It really is, it's more of a lack of function and maybe a lack of size as well associated with it. So remember we talked about, we were going to look at two cycles, ovarian and menstrual. The ovarian cycle is development of the egg. Okay. So you have the first part is the follicular phase. The second part is the luteal phase. And then we're going to look at the menstrual cycle as well. The big player in ovulation is called the luteal surge. There's a sharp spike in that. It's again one of those kind of neat little positive feedback things we see in female reproductive. Fertilization is usually found in the uterus. And we talked a little bit about the corpus luteum. That, again, that takes over with progesterone and estrogen secretion. And what's left when it begins to, in the absence of implantation, is called the corpus albicans. And we're going to go over all those stuff. And that really concludes the review. Hopefully you can hear it. If you're not, please feel free to send me emails, contact me in any way, shape, or form, or see me in class if you have some questions about that. Thank you very much.